So coming back to land and the underground environment, I'll be talking about the work that I've done and collaborators have done in northern Alberta in the oil sands. I use the term tar sands in the title of this talk to be a bit provocative, but coming from Alberta myself, I normally call them the oil sands conversationally. The French term of bituminous sands is actually more accurate because the substance in question is bitumen, which brings together oil and various other minerals and soils. This work is being done as part of a series of grants from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council. I've been fortunate to have 3 grants on related topics. The last 2 have been community-based and very much working with communities to set the agenda and set the questions. So rather than talk about a specific project that I've done, I'll just talk about the nature of our partnership and some of the other work that people have been doing. Okay, there we go. So some of the partners, there's a number of First Nations affiliated formally and informally, other Indigenous communities including Métis. McGill University is a partner through my co-applicant Colin Scott, and Colin is supervising Janelle Baker, who's here. Janelle and I like to cross-promote each other's work whenever we can. So, and as I mentioned, I have funding from the Social Science Humanities Research Council at University of Saskatchewan, and gracious contributions from the Indigenous partners, including translation services, which are critical in some of the communities where we work because a number of the most knowledgeable people do not speak English. Some of the questions we're looking at are up here, and I'll try to read them for those of you who are having a hard time reading the slides. Basically, the mechanisms by which Indigenous communities engage with the state to participate in decision-making, including environmental impact assessment, which is formalized in Canadian law, duty to consult, which came out of court judgments, in part driven by First Nations in the oil sands area. There is now a duty to consult Indigenous people about their interests embedded in Canadian constitutional law, given the treaty rights and Aboriginal rights that people hold that are being implicated by these explorations. Impact benefit agreements is something that has been mentioned. I'm not in a position to talk about impact benefit agreements very much because they're confidential, and suffice it to say that many of them for a large project in this area would range into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Food sovereignty, multi-species relations, sacred landscapes, Indigenous state relations, Indigenous corporate relations. The oil sands presents a very interesting case study for all of these, simply because of again, the extreme nature of the extraction, the very intensive investment of capital and political capital by representatives of the Canadian state and the Alberta government in support of extraction. And again, treaty and Aboriginal rights legislation and, implementation. These are continued to be revealed in Canadian law and through negotiation processes. Particularly, it's necessary to mention the Aboriginal rights of Métis people, which have only begun to be clarified by the courts over the past few years, at the exact same time that the land base that these rights would be practiced on is being radically changed, as I'll show. So extreme extraction, I have to show a few stats here, and most of these involve capital investment figures. This is a very intensive set of mega projects, in many cases multi-billion-dollar mega projects that are contiguous to one another. So the cumulative impacts are very large. Production will increase from a current 2.8 million barrels per day to 3.9 million barrels per day by 2027. These increases are already baked in by projects that have come on stream in the last few years or will be coming on stream. So even though we hear about an oil crisis and a price crisis and problems this is causing for Alberta, the industry is continuing to grow. There's estimated to be 165 billion barrels of bitumen in the oil sands alone. This does not include conventional oil in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So this is the 3rd largest proven reserve behind Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, quite likely the largest unproven reserve, and many of these deposits are very difficult to access, but the technology is continuing to develop. Capital investment ranges over the last 3 years into the next couple of years between $25 and $30 billion per year. So again, it might be challenging to find another small area, particularly in the north, that is subject to this level of capital investment, new technologies. pipelines, power lines, roads, everything that goes along with it, refining capacity, open pit mines, in situ processes for resources that are not mineable, as Janelle mentioned. Getting back to environmental impact assessment, one key debate is that the major projects, such as the large projects like huge mines, are considered major projects in federal law, and so are subject to a more rigorous environmental assessment process. The in situ projects that do not require mining are not subject to these same federal laws because they're not considered major projects, even though this is the new field of growth for the industry. Thanks. Okay, so it's the largest source of income for the Alberta government as well, the bitumen royalties. As Janelle showed, we're on Treaty 8 lands here, and the nature of Treaty 8 is still contested, whether it's a land cession agreement or a agreement to share the land, as First Nations contend. And again, the Métis situation, their Aboriginal rights are still being revealed by the courts. One of my colleagues, the person who sort of got me into this business, was involved both as a trapper on his trap line here and also as a representative of his First Nation as a land management officer. So he's here in a dual role, and he's taking a picture of this large cut block with oil infrastructure in the middle of it. And he told me later that it was sad to go back to his trap line and see it like this, and it felt like a dream because in the 70s he accessed the trap line by dog sled, and now there's roads all over the place and large disturbances. So the idea of living well, Mi'kmaq, we've already heard some cognate terms from other Algonquian languages, entails having time in the bush, having a proper relationship with animals, teaching family members how to access these things and to live in a good way. And so these things are still happening. Bush food is very important to people. The young man pictured here helping his grandfather can hunt on his own, drive a vehicle on his own, do everything he needs to do in that context. We're actually camping here on a piece of land that was disturbed by the oil patch. So people are accessing sites through roads and cut lines that are created by industry and using the land in their own way. But there are still threats and contamination and loss of species and biodiversity due to this exploration. So the name of the partnership I'm directing is Cultural Politics of Energy in Northern Alberta. And we wanted to get the idea that it was politically interesting, but also culturally interesting and culturally a very rich place. So we kicked off our current partnership with a large meeting in Athabasca, Alberta. Some of the people at this meeting were here. Mike Beaver, who is depicted in the last slide, is an elder who advises in particular myself. There's other people here who know Mike as well. We had other elders at the meeting, and it really helped us set an agenda. One of the things that people wanted to find out was, could the scholars who were present help them understand the research that had already been conducted? And so rather than doing new research, or along with doing new research, finding out and synthesizing information that was already out there was seen as being of great value. We have a couple of new tenure-track researchers affiliated with the project at Athabasca University in Northern Alberta. Janelle Baker, I don't know your nickname, Janelle, but I won't share it anyway. Josie Auger, who went from being an advisor and a representative of Big Stone Cree Nation to being now a fellow researcher and collaborator in that way. Real quick here, I mentioned the meta-study and the synthesis we did, and Tara Jolly and myself authored it. We looked at several hundred different pieces of work, including gray literature that had been done by industry, regulatory reports, and media and peer-reviewed information. And we got a lot of information that pointed towards a crisis of confidence in the industry, severe health risks, threats to food sovereignty, threats to people's use of a sacred landscape, and threats to people's ability to teach their children how to live the good life. And this all came through very strongly in our report, which was done for SSHRC. And I'm not going to read it, we don't have time. But a shorter version of this is now being published in the journal Human Ecology for those who are interested in finding out an authoritative, we hope, overview of social science research in the oil sands. So one thing I do want to talk about a little bit is a new proposal that's been put forward to reclaim the lands after the mining is through. Typically the mine sites have a life of 30 to 50 years, and they're going to be turned into lakes. So what we have here is a map of the oil sands leases in the mineable area. Every single mine pit and every single tailings pond, which are massive leaking garbage pails basically, will eventually be capped and turned into a lake with technology that has never been applied in the context of mining for petroleum. So it's been applied in mineral mines in Australia with mixed results in BC, but obviously when you put water on top of oil, different things happen. Experimentally, this has not really been proven, and there's been problems with the test lakes that they've developed on these sites, but it's still the go-to strategy that is still endorsed by the environmental impact assessment process. I just want to show one more picture. This is an imaginative image of the future and the present. What you see is a cutaway diagram of an end pit lake. In the foreground, you see oil sands mining, the largest trucks and excavators in the world down in the pit. In the background, lo and behold, it's already been turned into a lake. And I don't know if you can see properly, but there's people happily fishing and boating on the lake. And so this is an important part of responding to federal law, which requires that there be no net loss to fisheries habitat. So they're rerouting rivers, changing existing lakes and wetlands, altering the water table in fundamental ways. And so the solution to this no net loss is the end pit lakes, which we are assured will be safe and healthy for fish. And so there's a lot of problems, a lot of lack of confidence in traditional food resources in the area. The end pit lakes probably won't help much. And they're going to be cyborgs because they're continued to be tied into various types of remediation technologies, but they'll also flow into existing rivers and streams. So the potential exists to contaminate possibly the entire Arctic watershed. Just a couple of things. One of the ways we've done some contributions for our partnership is to hold sessions at international panels. I myself do not have PhD students. My university does not have a PhD program in anthropology. So I've worked with master's students, and I won't tell you about the thesis research that they've done, but it's been very interesting examples of applied anthropology, including going to UNESCO to lobby for protection of UNESCO heritage sites that are implicated by the oil sands. But some of these panels, I think, were really successful. We were able to identify a number of PhD students and early career researchers internationally who have been doing ethnographic research in the oil sands and bring them together for a series of panels, at which Janelle has participated at a couple as well. I really felt this was an important contribution, and out of that came a book project which will be forthcoming from Routledge, and we settled on the title of Extracting Home in the Oil Sands, because we wanted to have the word extracting in there, but we also wanted to get across the idea that this is a homeland for people and not just a resource hinterland, which is how the North is often portrayed in Canada. I don't think I have time to say too much more. I have some nice photos of contaminated water spills, but I'll show them to you later. So that's all for now. Thank you.